A deadly storm struck mid-flight, rattling the massive aircraft as if it were nothing more than a toy suspended in the sky. The passengers had already been warned that the weather ahead would be rough, but no one expected the violent turbulence that arrived without mercy. Thunder cracked so loudly it felt as if it came from inside the cabin. A blinding flash of lightning illuminated the windows, exposing hundreds of terrified faces, mothers clutching their children, elderly passengers whispering prayers, travelers gripping their armrests with trembling hands. The airplane shook so aggressively that luggage compartments began to pop open, bags falling and hitting the aisle with heavy thumps. Rain hammered the fuselage, each drop sounding like a nervous heartbeat. The plane lurched downward, then jerked back up so sharply that several passengers screamed. Flight attendants struggled to maintain their balance as they rushed to secure loose items, but the sudden tilt sent one of them crashing into a seat. Oxygen masks dangled overhead, swaying wildly with the unstable motion of the aircraft. Alarms beeped somewhere near the cockpit, an unsettling reminder that something was terribly wrong. Inside the cockpit, the pilots fought to regain control. The captain's voice had been steady moments earlier, but now he was yelling commands, gripping the controls with white-knuckled tension. The co-pilot tried to stabilize their altitude, but the storm refused to release its hold. Lightning cracked again, this time so close that the entire cockpit flashed white. A deafening boom followed, and the aircraft jolted to the side as if struck by a giant invisible fist. Panels rattled, lights flickered, and warning messages flooded the cockpit screens. Then came the moment that changed everything. Another violent jolt sent both pilots crashing forward, their heads hitting the control panel hard. In an instant, the cockpit fell silent except for the storm's rage outside. Both men slumped over, unconscious, their hands sliding off the controls. The plane, now without guidance, began to dip nose first. The descent was sharp enough that passengers felt their stomachs drop, a sinking sensation that made screams erupt throughout the cabin. People looked around in confusion and terror, speechless at what was happening. The flight attendants attempted to open the cockpit door, but turbulence kept throwing them off balance. Fear spread like wildfire. A baby wailed from somewhere near the back. A man shouted for everyone to stay calm, though his own voice cracked with panic. A woman gripped her seat until her knuckles turned pale, whispering the same desperate prayer over and over again. For a moment, it felt like everyone on board collectively realized that their fate hung by a thread. Among the chaos sat a small figure, a 10-year-old girl named Alina. She had been traveling alone for the first time in her life, seated by the window with a small backpack filled with coloring books and snacks. Like everyone else, she felt the terrifying drop in altitude. Her heart pounded, her throat tightened, and her eyes watered from fear. But unlike the adults around her, who were frozen in panic, something inside the little girl sparked. An instinct, a memory, a courage she didn't know she had. Her father had been a pilot. Not a commercial one, but a skilled private pilot who loved flying more than anything. For years, he had taught her everything he knew, sitting her beside him during flight simulations at home, explaining each control and every emergency procedure. She would watch him with fascination, absorbing every detail like a sponge. To her, flying had always been magical, a dance between machine and sky. But never, not even in her wildest imagination, did she think she'd ever need those lessons. As the plane tilted again, forcing passengers to cling to their seats, Alina looked around and realized something was very wrong. She unbuckled her seatbelt while everyone else remained frozen. A frightened stranger reached out, trying to stop her, but she gently slipped past his grasp. She whispered to him that she needed to help. The man shook his head, too terrified to argue. No one else seemed to notice the little girl making her way down the aisle. The airplane lurched again, this time sideways, sending food trays sliding and drinks spilling onto the floor. Alina held onto each seat she passed, inching forward carefully but determinedly. The storm roared outside like an angry beast, and the plane's metal frame groaned under the pressure. Wind slammed against the windows with tremendous force, each boom making passengers whimper. But the young girl kept moving, her small hands gripping armrests, her feet stumbling but never stopping. A flight attendant, still trying to regain her balance after falling earlier, noticed the child approaching. She tried to reach out, telling her to sit back down, but before she could move toward her, a burst of turbulence threw her against the wall. Alina steadied herself and continued toward the cockpit door. She could hear the muffled alarms coming from the other side. No voices. No commands. Nothing but warning beeps and the unrelenting storm. With all her strength, she pushed the door latch. To her surprise, the door wasn't locked. The pilots had been too busy fighting the storm to secure it. The door swung open slightly. A gust of cold air from the cockpit hit her face, carrying with it the sharp scent of overheated electronics. She slipped inside and gasped. Both pilots were motionless, slumped forward in their seats. The control panel flashed red with warnings she recognized only from simulations. The plane had lost altitude. The nose was dipping. If someone didn't act, they would hit turbulence so severe the aircraft could break apart. Fear shot through her body, but she forced herself to breathe. She remembered her father's voice, the calm way he would explain even the scariest emergencies. If you ever panic, the plane will panic with you. She took a shaky step forward. Her hands trembled as she climbed into the captain's seat. The seat felt enormous, swallowing her small frame. The controls were heavy, far heavier than in the simulator, but she wrapped her fingers around them with determination. The storm screamed around her, lightning illuminating the cockpit in blinding flashes, but she focused only on the screens, the buttons, the descent rate. The plane dipped again, so sharply that it sent a wave of gasps through the cabin. Alina pulled the controls upward with all her strength. Nothing happened for a second. Then slowly, the nose of the aircraft began to lift. The plane groaned under the strain, turbulence shaking it mercilessly, but she kept pulling, her arms burning, her eyes stinging with tears of fear and focus. She remembered her father's lessons: steady hands, controlled breathing, never fight the plane, guide it. She adjusted the flaps, her small fingers moving with surprising confidence. The alarms kept blaring, but she ignored them. All she could hear was her father's voice in her memory, reminding her of every step she needed to take. Outside the cockpit door, passengers clung to their seats as the plane slowly stabilized. The downward plunge eased. The violent shaking softened, slightly. Just enough for people to breathe again, though no one knew why. No one knew that a child was now fighting to save them. Alina steadied the aircraft, her eyes darting between the gauges. Altitude was still dropping, but not nearly as fast. She needed help. She needed guidance. Her father had taught her how to use the radio, but she had never imagined doing it alone in a real emergency. She pressed the communication button, her voice trembling as she spoke. Mayday, Mayday. This is Flight 237. Both pilots are unconscious. I'm trying to control the plane. I need help. The air traffic controller on the other end froze. His heart raced at the sound of a child's voice. He asked her age. I'm 10, she answered, her voice barely a whisper. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, but there was no time for disbelief. He immediately gave her instructions, keeping his voice calm, slow, and clear. She listened intently, adjusting the aircraft exactly as he guided her. She followed every command, fighting the storm with every ounce of strength she had. The thunder roared again, shaking the plane violently, but this time she held it steady. Lightning flashed across the sky, but she kept her eyes glued to the controls. Turbulence hit from all directions, tossing the aircraft like a leaf in the wind, but she refused to let go. No one in the cabin knew that the little girl who had disappeared moments earlier was now their only hope. No one could see her small hands gripping the controls with the determination of someone far older. No one could hear her whispering to herself, repeating her father's instructions, refusing to give in to fear. And yet, in that moment, she carried the weight of 183 lives on her tiny shoulders. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the controls, her fingers barely able to wrap around the cold metal levers. The cockpit vibrated under the relentless force of the storm, each jolt threatening to knock her out of the seat. The alarms screamed from every corner of the control panel, sharp and urgent warnings that blended with the thunder outside into a terrifying symphony of chaos. Red lights flashed in her eyes, blinking rapidly, as if the plane itself was begging for help. The aircraft kept dropping, sinking through the turbulent air in a stomach-twisting descent that made the girl feel weightless for split seconds at a time. She could feel her body lifting off the seat with every sudden plunge, only to slam back down a second later. Outside the cockpit windows, the storm grew even stronger, dark clouds swirling like monstrous shadows ready to swallow the plane whole. Sheets of rain smacked the glass, blurring everything beyond into streaks of silver and black. Lightning cracked so close it lit up the cockpit in a blinding white flash that made her flinch. She tightened her grip on the yoke, her knuckles turning pale. Her heart thumped so loudly she could feel it pulsing inside her ears. She had never felt fear like this before, not when she fell off her bike, not when she got lost in a mall, not even when she watched her dog run onto a busy road. This fear was bigger than anything she had ever known. It wrapped around her chest, squeezing every breath, whispering that she was just a child, that she shouldn't be here, that this was impossible. But in the midst of the terror, a memory flickered in her mind. Her father's voice, calm and steady, speaking to her during long evenings in front of the flight simulator he kept at home. He would adjust the settings to create storms, turbulence, engine failures, anything that could go wrong in real flight. Then he would let her take control. "Don't grab it too hard," he would say gently. "A pilot guides the plane, never fights it. And breathe. A plane responds to a calm mind." She repeated those words to herself now. Don't fight the plane. Don't fight the storm. Just guide. Just breathe. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her trembling fingers. The descent rate on the display was dangerously high. If she didn't act, the aircraft could lose structural integrity or hit a pressure pocket strong enough to tear something crucial apart. She forced her terrified mind to focus on the controls. She pulled back the yoke slowly, trying to keep her movements steady despite her shaking arms. The plane resisted at first, too heavy for her small strength. It felt like trying to lift a mountain. Her arms quivered, her muscles burning, but she didn't stop. She leaned back in the seat, putting her whole body into the pull. Inch by inch, the nose of the plane started to rise. It was subtle at first, a small adjustment, barely noticeable. But then the altitude display slowed its decline, hesitated, and began to climb ever so slightly. She exhaled shakily, relief washing over her like warm water. But the moment was short-lived. The storm hurled another violent blast of wind at the left side of the aircraft, flipping it sharply to one side. She let out a startled yelp as the plane tilted, sending a wave of fear through the cabin behind her. She could hear faint screams echoing through the cockpit door, passengers thrown against their seats by the sudden roll. She gripped the controls again, this time forcing herself to stay calm. Her father had taught her this too. Crosswind roll recovery. She had done it dozens of times on the simulator, but those were games compared to this. She pushed one control slightly forward while pulling the other back, countering the tilt with the precision she had practiced. Under her father's watchful gaze. Slowly, the plane returned to level flight. The alarms continued to blare. Her ears rang. Her breath came in shallow bursts. But she didn't let go. She kept her hands on the controls, steadying the aircraft as best as she could. Her feet, hanging inches off the floor, tried to reach the rudder pedals. She stretched her legs as far as she could until her toes finally touched the metal. She pressed down gently, aligning the plane with the wind. Her entire body felt too small, too weak, too fragile for the enormous machine she was controlling. But she refused to think about that. She had to stay focused. For the people behind her. For herself. For the pilots who lay unconscious beside her. And for her father, who had given her the knowledge she needed without ever imagining she would need it in a moment like this. The storm outside intensified again. Rain lashed the windows so hard it sounded like cracking ice. The wipers swished back and forth in a frantic rhythm, barely keeping up with the downpour. Another burst of lightning struck nearby, illuminating the silhouette of the wing, which shuddered under the force of the wind. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her mind racing as she tried to remember everything she'd learned. She adjusted the throttle slightly, keeping the engines from overworking. She remembered her father teaching her to respect the engines. A plane doesn't like to be pushed too hard. Let it do what it's built to do. Just guide it. Just breathe. She took another slow breath, forcing herself to keep calm. Her lungs trembled, her chest tight, but she managed to steady her breathing. She blinked away tears that threatened to blur her vision. She couldn't allow herself to cry. Not now. She needed clear eyes, steady hands, a calm heart. The plane dipped again as the storm unleashed a fresh wave of turbulence. Her small body jerked against the seatbelt. Her hands nearly slipped off the controls, but she tightened her grip. She pushed back gently against the turbulence, guiding the plane through pockets of unstable air. Each jolt sent fear shooting through her spine, but she refused to let it overwhelm her. She checked the altimeter, gasping when she saw that the altitude was still dangerously low. She pulled the nose up again, this time more confidently. The plane responded faster now, as if it was beginning to trust her. The altitude began to climb steadily. The engines roared, the wings flexed, but the aircraft held strong, rising inch by inch, fighting against the storm along with her. She could hear the faint hum of terrified whispers from the cabin behind her. People must have realized the plane had stabilized slightly, but they wouldn't know why. They wouldn't know a child was fighting for their lives. They wouldn't know the courage sitting in the cockpit with hands no bigger than the control levers. Her body ached from the effort, her back, her arms, her legs all strained, but she didn't stop. The storm threw everything it had at her, blasting winds, lightning, thunder, and turbulence in a relentless assault. But she pushed back, guided by every lesson her father had taught her. She remembered the times she had crashed the simulator. How her father would pause the system and ask what she thought went wrong. He never scolded her. He encouraged her. He taught her to think like a pilot. To stay calm even when the alarms screamed. To trust herself. He planted in her a quiet confidence she didn't know she carried, until now, when it mattered more than anything. The vibrations lessened slightly. The plane leveled out. The descent stopped completely. A thin beam of light broke through the clouds ahead, a brief, golden ribbon in a sky full of darkness. She stared at it with wide, hopeful eyes. Maybe the worst had passed. Maybe she had done enough to keep them all alive. But deep inside, she knew the storm wasn't finished. The plane was still too low. The pilots were still unconscious. The passengers were still terrified. And she was still just a little girl trying to fly a massive aircraft through a storm that even trained adults would fear. Her breath hitched as another alarm went off, this one less urgent, more like a reminder. She recognized it. Altitude insufficient. She needed to climb higher. She tightened her grip once more, her body trembling from exhaustion, but she pulled the yoke back again. Slowly, the plane responded. Slowly, the sky grew lighter. Slowly, courage replaced fear inside her chest. She fought the storm with every ounce of strength she had. Every memory her father left her, every breath she could manage. And somehow, against all odds, she kept the plane flying. With zero experience in real flight, she radioed air traffic control, her trembling fingers hovering over the button as if it were the most dangerous switch in the world. Her heart hammered so violently she could feel it thumping through her chest, each beat louder than the storm beating against the aircraft. She swallowed hard, trying to remember exactly what her father taught her about communication protocols. Her mind spun with 1,000 panicked thoughts, but she forced herself to focus on the one thing she knew was true. She needed help, and she needed it now. She leaned toward the microphone, her breath shaky, her voice barely more than a whisper as she pressed the transmission button. Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 237. Both pilots are unconscious. I'm trying to fly the plane. There was a crackle of static in her ears, then a stunned silence. The air traffic controller on the other end froze. The voice that responded belonged to a man who had spent decades handling emergencies, but nothing in his career prepared him for the sound of a frightened child calling for help from a commercial jet. He asked her to repeat her message, disbelief tightening his voice. She did, her voice trembling, her words tiny yet carrying the weight of 183 lives behind her. You said, you're 10 years old. The controller asked carefully, almost as if he couldn't trust his own ears. Yes, she breathed. Her voice cracked. I'm 10, and I'm flying the plane. Another pause, heavier than the storm rolling around her. In the background, she could hear muffled voices, other controllers, supervisors, perhaps even emergency dispatchers, all trying to make sense of a situation that seemed impossible. A child flying a passenger jet. In the middle of a severe storm. With fuel running low. It was unthinkable. But the plane didn't care what was unthinkable. It cared only about physics, altitude, speed, pressure, and the merciless force of the storm. A sharp blast of wind slammed into the right side of the aircraft, shoving it sideways so violently she screamed. The plane tilted, the right wing dipping dangerously as rain smashed against the windows like thousands of tiny glass bullets. The entire aircraft groaned, metal straining under the assault. She gripped the controls with all the strength her small hands could muster. Her arms shook, her shoulders burned, her fingers felt like they were slipping. She pulled back on the yoke, trying to counter the sideways push. The plane resisted. The storm pushed harder. She pushed harder still, teeth clenched, lips trembling, tears stinging her eyes. Just breathe, she reminded herself. Guide the plane. Don't fight it. Remember what Dad taught you. She steadied the jet, inch by inch, fighting both gravity and the storm's fury. The sound of the wind outside was fierce, a deafening roar that felt like a beast trying to claw its way into the cockpit. Rain hammered the windshield so hard she could barely see the faint glow of lightning flickering behind the dark clouds. Every flash illuminated the cockpit for a split second, casting ghostly shadows on the unconscious pilots slumped beside her. Her breath came fast and shallow. She forced it to slow, remembering her father's lectures about panic. Panic turns small problems into big ones, he used to say. But staying calm lets you see what you need to do next. The air traffic controller came back, this time speaking slower, calmer, as if trying to steady her with his tone alone. He told her not to worry. He told her to breathe. He told her they would help her land the plane. But beneath his steady voice, she could still hear the fear, the disbelief, because deep down, he knew the truth, the odds were almost zero. A 10-year-old child, alone in a cockpit, battling a storm that even seasoned pilots dreaded, with fuel rapidly running low, the situation was impossibly grim. But she didn't think about odds. She didn't have the luxury of thinking about what was likely or unlikely. She only thought about survival, hers and the 183 people behind her. Another blast of wind slammed into the aircraft, this time from the left. The plane jolted violently, the wings flexing under pressure. She heard a metallic groan that sent chills down her spine, the kind of sound that suggested the aircraft was being pushed far beyond its comfort zone. She corrected the tilt again, her legs kicking forward so her toes could press the rudder pedals. Her feet barely reached them, but she stretched as far as she could, applying gentle pressure just like her father had taught her. The controller asked her what the instruments were reading. She strained to understand the flashing numbers, trying to remember what each meant. Her father had shown her dozens of times, but everything was harder now, louder, scarier, more urgent. She gave the controller altitude, speed, heading. Her voice shook but she got the words out. Good, the controller said, though she could tell he was lying. Good job. You're doing great. I want you to keep the nose level and try to maintain your current altitude. Can you do that? She nodded, forgetting for a moment that he couldn't see her. Yes, she said. I'm trying. Another jolt shook the plane. A bolt of lightning streaked across the sky, lighting up the clouds in a blinding flash. The girl's heart leapt into her throat as thunder boomed so loudly it felt like the plane had been struck. But the engines still roared, the wings still held, and the plane still responded to her touch. Still, the fuel gauge flashed a warning. A soft alarm chimed, almost apologetically compared to the screaming alerts from earlier. Low fuel. The plane was burning through precious reserves trying to fight the storm. Her stomach knotted. She knew enough to understand what low fuel meant. The controller knew it too. His voice grew even more urgent as he gave her instructions, but he still tried to sound calm, for her sake. Listen to me, he said. You're doing incredibly well. You're very brave. We're guiding you to the nearest airport. You just have to keep the plane steady. Can you do that a little longer? She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound of his voice ground her. She imagined her father beside her, hand on her shoulder, smiling the way he always did when she completed a simulator challenge. She imagined him telling her she could do this. She imagined him proud. Yes, she whispered. I can do it. She tightened her grip again. Her arms shook with exhaustion, her breathing ragged. Sweat dripped down her forehead, mixing with tears she didn't even realize were falling. Her entire body felt like it was about to collapse under the weight of the responsibility she carried. But she kept going. The storm hurled wave after wave of turbulence at the aircraft. Wind slammed the fuselage from every direction. Rain battered the cockpit windows, turning the world outside into a blurry swirl of darkness and lightning. Through it all, she held the controls with a courage far beyond her years. The passengers behind her had no idea who was saving them. They had no idea that a small girl, barely tall enough to see over the control panel, was fighting for their lives with a determination even adults might not possess. Some were praying, some were crying, some were clinging to their loved ones, believing every second might be their last. But she refused to give up on them. She refused to let fear win. She refused to let the storm decide their fate. The controller guided her step by step, explaining how to adjust altitude, how to correct her course, how to keep the wings level even when the storm tried to tear them off. She listened to every instruction, her hands moving instinctively, guided by both her father's teachings and her own sheer willpower. The plane shook, but she didn't. Not anymore. She felt something inside her shift, something powerful, something brave, something unstoppable. She no longer felt like a frightened child battling an impossible situation. She felt like a pilot. A real one. And she was not going to let anyone down. She kept the jet steady, her heart pounding, her breath trembling, her whole body aching, but her spirit stronger than ever. Fuel was running low, the storm was still raging, and the situation remained dangerously fragile, but she pressed on. Because 183 lives depended on her. Finally, through the veil of dark, storm-laden clouds, she spotted it. A sliver of hope cutting across the endless gray, a long strip of tarmac that promised safety, salvation, and the end of the nightmare that had gripped everyone on board. Her eyes, wide with fear and determination, locked onto the runway as if her life, and the lives of 183 others, depended on it. Because in that moment, they did. Every flicker of lightning illuminated the endless storm outside the cockpit, casting shadows on her small face, revealing the sweat, the tears, the grim determination etched into features that seemed far too young to be carrying such a monumental responsibility. She had made it this far, guided only by memory, instinct, and the ghostly echo of her father's voice in her mind. The winds howled, striking the aircraft sideways with ferocious intensity. Rain lashed the fuselage so violently it felt like pebbles hitting glass, a relentless torrent of punishment that tried to shake her resolve. The plane groaned under the strain, flexing its enormous wings as if testing whether the child at the controls could withstand the immense power of the storm. Her small hands gripped the yoke with a white-knuckled intensity, arms trembling from hours of tension, her knuckles raw from exertion. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but she ignored it. There was no rest. There was only survival. She knew that one misstep, one wrong movement, could send the plane, and everyone on board, plunging into chaos. With deliberate care, she began lowering the landing gear. The controls felt foreign, heavier than any simulation her father had run at home, as if the plane itself resisted the action, testing whether she was worthy of controlling it. A sharp jolt threw her body forward, but she held on, leaning into the yoke, every fiber of her being locked on the task ahead. Sparks of electricity from a damaged panel flickered across the console, tiny flashes that sent shivers down her spine. Warning lights danced and blinked in frantic urgency, but she didn't flinch. She had trained for this, even if only in memory, and her mind now moved with clarity despite the chaos surrounding her. The aircraft pitched slightly as she adjusted the descent, following the invisible line from the clouds to the runway below. The rain continued to hammer the cockpit windows, distorting her view, but she kept her eyes focused, tracking the lights of the runway as they began to grow larger and clearer, a beacon of hope amidst the storm. The thunder rolled like the drums of war, shaking the plane violently, but she maintained control, countering every tilt and sway with precise, almost instinctive movements. Every correction felt like an eternity compressed into seconds, each small adjustment carrying a weight that would have crushed an adult. She refused to be crushed. She refused to allow fear to dominate. Her resolve hardened with every passing heartbeat. The runway lights grew nearer, the tarmac stretching out like a lifeline beneath the plane. Her fingers moved automatically over the throttle, adjusting speed, balancing the aircraft's descent. She remembered her father's lessons about glide slope, about approach angle, about speed management. She visualized the simulations, the countless hours spent in the tiny cockpit at home, the calm explanations her father had given about every potential emergency. Each memory now transformed into action, each lesson now a lifeline. The plane responded to her touch, sluggishly at first, then more confidently, as if acknowledging the courage and skill of its unlikely pilot. The turbulence intensified as she entered the lower clouds, the plane buffeted from all sides. She could feel it shake beneath her, wings flexing under the stress. The fuselage groaning like it was crying out under the storm's assault. Lightning cracked close enough to make her ears ring, each flash illuminating the instruments and revealing every flickering warning light. The engines roared under strain, and the sound vibrated through her chest, but she remained focused, pressing every pedal, twisting every control, every movement deliberate, precise, necessary. She knew there was no room for error. Every adjustment mattered, every heartbeat counted. She carefully aligned the aircraft with the centerline of the runway. Her small foot pressed the rudder pedals with determination, guiding the plane through the wind that tried relentlessly to push it off course. Rain obliterated the view below, creating a mirror of silver streaks that blurred the tarmac and made the runway look as if it were floating in the clouds. She had to trust the instruments now, every gauge and display her lifeline as much as the skill she had inherited from her father. She adjusted the flaps, slowing the plane just enough to prevent overshoot but fast enough to maintain lift, a delicate balance she had rehearsed countless times on simulations, yet now it carried the weight of real lives. The landing gear touched down with a jarring thud, sending a shockwave through the entire cabin. Sparks erupted where damaged panels made contact with metal, small bursts of light that danced across the cockpit and briefly blinded her. The plane skidded hard on the wet runway, brakes screaming, tires fighting for traction on the slick surface. Her heart leapt into her throat as the plane shuddered, but she kept the yoke steady, guiding the aircraft with unwavering precision. Every movement mattered, every small correction critical. The engines roared as she applied reverse thrust, slowing the aircraft inch by inch, refusing to let the storm and slippery tarmac dictate the outcome. The passengers inside had no idea what was happening in the cockpit. They felt the violent landing, the jolts, the sparks, the frightening screech of metal and rubber, but they didn't know that it was a 10-year-old girl keeping them alive. They didn't know that this small child, trembling but resolute, had fought a storm of unimaginable intensity and guided a massive jet to safety. They could only hold their breaths, clinging to loved ones, whispering prayers, gripping seats until their knuckles were white, unaware of the miracle unfolding at the front of the aircraft. She guided the plane down the remainder of the runway with painstaking care. Each foot of asphalt conquered was a victory, each meter a testament to courage, skill, and determination far beyond her years. The wind screamed, the rain lashed, and the engines groaned, but the aircraft responded to her. The nose of the plane lifted slightly as she balanced the controls, making sure it didn't dip too low. The tires screeched, sparks flew, the plane shuddered violently under the stress, but she refused to let go. She could feel her body trembling, muscles screaming for release, but the focus in her mind was absolute. There was no room for weakness. There was no room for hesitation. Every second mattered, every action could mean life or death. Finally, after what felt like an eternity compressed into minutes, the plane came to a halt. A collective sigh of relief must have erupted throughout the cabin, though she didn't hear it over the roar of the engines, the echoes of the storm, and her own racing heartbeat. The aircraft trembled on the runway, engines slowly winding down, tires still slick with rain. She let out a shuddering breath, her small body sagging slightly in the captain's seat. Her hands still gripped the yoke, trembling, but the plane was safe. All 183 passengers were alive. Every life she had fought for had been preserved. The nightmare had ended. The cockpit fell into an eerie silence. Sparks from damaged panels still flickered weakly, warning lights blinked, and the storm continued to rage beyond the walls of the aircraft, but inside, there was a fragile calm. She looked around at the pilots slumped beside her, both unconscious but alive. The instruments steadied, and the aircraft rested on the runway like a wounded but victorious warrior. She allowed herself a small smile, tears running freely down her cheeks, a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and awe at what she had just accomplished. She had done the impossible. Against all odds, she had done the unthinkable. Outside, emergency vehicles began to appear, their lights cutting through the mist and rain. Personnel raced toward the aircraft, prepared for disaster, but greeted instead by the miraculous sight of a young girl, alone in the cockpit, having landed a commercial jet through one of the worst storms imaginable. The firefighters, paramedics, and police officers approached cautiously, unsure of what they would find. When they realized the plane was intact, the passengers alive, and the cockpit occupied by a child, they paused, speechless. Her bravery defied logic, her courage impossible to measure in conventional terms. Passengers began to look around, realizing gradually that they had survived what could have been certain disaster. Mothers held children closer, adults wept quietly, and the hum of shock and awe filled the cabin. They didn't yet know who had saved them, but the magnitude of their survival sank in. Every face reflected a mixture of gratitude, relief, and disbelief. And in that moment, As the storm continued to rage just beyond the runway, one small figure in the cockpit became a legend. She had faced a force of nature, battled fear, and demonstrated courage that would be remembered forever. Her father's lessons, once playful and routine, had transformed into life-saving skill. Her memories of simulations and guidance had become reality, a bridge between childhood knowledge and heroic action. She had risen to a challenge that no 10-year-old should ever face, yet she had met it with determination, focus, and the heart of a true pilot. Her bravery would be told and retold, not just as a story of survival, but as an example of courage, resilience, and the extraordinary capabilities hidden within those who refuse to give up. The rain began to ease slightly, though the storm still raged in the distance. The plane rested safely on the tarmac, passengers beginning to disembark with careful steps, faces pale but alive. Emergency crews moved in, assisting those who needed help, checking for injuries, and securing the aircraft. Throughout the chaos, the child remained in her seat, exhausted but alive, the weight of her achievement slowly sinking in. She had done it. Against impossible odds, she had controlled the uncontrollable, guided the flight to safety, and preserved every life on board. Her courage had turned what could have been a tragedy into a miracle. In a single heroic moment, she became more than a child. She became a legend. The 10-year-old who had faced the storm, faced her fear, and saved 183 lives would never be forgotten. Her name, her bravery, and her extraordinary feat would echo through history as a testament to human courage.